author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. So said President Kennedy. And it seems that President Joe Biden is attempting to deny paternity for the Afghan withdrawal that's being widely condemned as a disaster on just about every scale. Even with his Herculean evacuation effort, he's seen hundreds of Americans and thousands of allies left stranded, yes, stranded, in the country. How can the president come back? And far more importantly, how can America recover? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we have a huge show for you this week, talking Joe Biden, the California recall, Afghanistan, and those two most defining issues of American politics, abortion and the Second Amendment. And while we're here, I'd just like to take a moment to welcome WNWF AM in Evergreen, Alabama, to the Liberty Nation team. Also, remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. We have a packed show coming up here on the Radio America Network, and as ever, we'll be dealing out the analysis straight and clean, minus the spin. This should have been President Biden's finest hour, almost 50 years at the levers of power, culminating the end of a 20-year war. What would have once been considered his crowning moment may now be the metaphorical guillotine that cuts right through the neck of his decade-long building of a legacy. How did it go so wrong for Joe Biden? Well, to figure out the precise steps that led to his snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, we're once again privileged to be joined by Dave Patterson, retired Air Force pilot and the former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, a man who regular listeners will know possesses a boundless knowledge of all things military. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be with you.
So my first question has to be, how did this turn from what should have been a soaring victory into something that has sunk Joe Biden's polling numbers so low that the idea of him running again in 2024, if indeed he's either willing or able to, has become a distant dream for Team Biden?
Well, Mark, I think that starting out, you said what should have been, and I don't think you can use what should have been and President Biden in the same sentence because that was never going to happen. He does not have, personally, the intellectual capacity to understand what the consequences of what he says are. And secondly, he does not have a staff, team, the national security prowess that would have allowed it to be a victory. And as far as polling numbers go, I think that when they mentioned that to the president, he said, is that in Warsaw or Gdansk?
So, Dave, I want to dig into the specifics of what went wrong here. The evacuation finished, and the president took to the airwaves to announce it all. And he said that his predecessor, Donald Trump, he obviously didn't mention him by name, had made an agreement to pull out on May 1st, suggesting that this would have been too soon and that it would have been reckless to do so. But I don't think that's the case, Dave. As we know, that the Taliban, as everybody within the security services should know, the Taliban and basically all of the Afghan fighters, they have a season for fighting. And this usually runs from spring once the weather permits, and that they have the funds coming in from the opium fields. Now, surely if Biden had stuck to Trump's plan, there wouldn't have been 70,000 plus Taliban fighters in the field, allowing more than enough time for the Afghan government to reposition itself after the US withdrawal. Now, is my analysis here, is it widely off the mark?
No, Mark, I think it's pretty much accurate. I think there are some things, though, that you have to consider in that when you're starting to do hypotheticals. First of all, had Trump's plan started with the election in November of 2020, when it would have started, then he would have had the time between November and May to execute on that plan. The plan was very clear about what was expected from the Taliban. What was expected from the Taliban never materialized. So the deal was off and would have been seen as so by the Trump administration. And then the consequences of what the Taliban began in May would have been airstrikes, considerable amount of damage to what eventually became their advance through Afghanistan. So I think if you're going to make a hypothetical on the one side, you also have to consider it on the other side as well. And a number of things, and I don't want to make this answer too long, but a number of things also. First of all, to have announced that you were going to bring people out starting May, but yet you didn't really do that until somewhere in the middle of July, I think people have to consider that as well. So from the beginning to the very end, this was a botched, bungled exercise, and it's Biden's exercise.
Yeah, let's try and dig into detail a little bit finer here. It seems that Biden, he blames Trump for the debacle of the evacuation. Now, you say that this was Biden's exercise. If he had done what Trump had initially planned, again, we're getting slightly into the hypotheticals, this mess wouldn't have occurred. Now, is it possible that the Taliban, and to some extent even the former Afghan government, did they suspect that Biden would handle this so badly? And is that why the government, it just seemed to fall as soon as the Taliban were at the Kabul gates?
Well, I think that looking at President Biden's past and the mistakes, and looking at our southern border, I think that it would have been an easy way to think that Biden would botch this as well. I mean, it's not like he doesn't have a history of bungling. And so consequently, someone who would put the faith of their nation in his hands would be truly, truly wrong.
Yes, so some would consider it a reckless move. Now, let's talk about what happens next, Dave. We have varying reports about how many Americans are left in situ, not to mention the thousands of Afghan allies who reports are already suggesting they're being hunted down, executed. They're receiving dark letters or death notices pinned up on their doors. What are the chances that this becomes one of the most, let's call it, significant hostage events of modern history? And if so, what's the goal there? Would it be for more resources or for further American humiliation?
Oh, I think that you're right on the mark. And I think that this is exactly what's going to happen. Now, consider that there is some modest amount of leverage that the United States does have in this hostage situation, and that we have approximately frozen funds, $9.5 to $10 billion worth. And the World Bank and IMF have stopped all aid. And that's going to be significant in terms of how you operate a country, because now you can't make small business loans, you can't do anything in terms of monetary transactions. So that's going to be a significant hurdle for the Taliban. And in a way, it will be somewhat of leverage for the U.S. But do not ever forget that Russia and China will be right there to help. And they may just obviate the entire impact of the sequestration of funds.
Yeah, well, I'd imagine that China, although in many respects, China and Russia are allies on some levels, there is still a very much deeper power play going on here, and one that if they could encourage the humiliation of America through further drawing out hostage situations, which we have seen in the past, works incredibly well at creating an anti-America sentiment or a negative cast over American policy. I think they would be all too willing to join in, and especially if that only costs them a few $1 million here and there. Now, Dave, one final question, if I may, and this is on the weaponry that got left behind. Now, President Trump suggested that it was in the region of $80 billion to $90 billion worth. Now, we've had a lot of national newspapers based out of Washington, for example, suggest that Trump's being hyperbolic with this, and that the real figure is somewhere more in terms of actual gear, close to $27 billion. Now, I got to ask, why do you think this wasn't destroyed? I mean, much of this gear, much of this equipment, it is flammable, it is explosive in nature. Why was it left behind?
Well, I think there are two questions here, actually. And one of them is, what is the truth about the amount of equipment that was left behind. Most of the estimates rely on a GAO report that went from 2003 to 2016 and the amount of material that was provided to the Afghans. Subsequent to 2016, a lot of that has been used up. But the fact is that there were considerable amounts of material left behind. I think that what's useful for the Afghan or the Taliban now is probably much less than people are reporting. They don't have anybody that's going to fly and maintain the Tucano T-29s. They're close air support turboprop aircraft. On the other hand, the Russians and Chinese will be happy to provide that to them. But nonetheless, maintaining a ability and capability to do that sort of thing is not trivial, and it will suck up a lot of money from the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese and Russians will allow for a certain amount of chaos because it suits their purpose. But after that, they'll be far more structured in how they deal with the Taliban. It's whether or not the Taliban will accept the structure. That's the real question. But as far as things left behind, you saw consistently the one picture of the C-130 that's kind of on its side. That's a pretty significant problem to correct, and certainly they don't have the maintenance to do that. But nonetheless, the ammunition and the small arms, that is a big deal, and that's kind of hard to destroy on your way out.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much. Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be tackling the big two, abortion and gun rights, in our special Talking Liberty segment. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Joe Schaefer to get into the mix on how Joe Biden plans to navigate the stormy waters of his own creation. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It seems the fallout from the Afghanistan withdrawals provided some distraction to the Fourth Estate. The media denizens are now able to comfortably look the other way on issues such as the border, the mounting battle between states' rights and federal overreach, the stunning blows dealt by the Supreme Court, and a whole host of others. But the news cycle always moves on, and at some point, the focus must drift back to the domestic crises that President Biden has singularly failed to address. Now, to discuss these cliff edges that await the administration, we're joined by political columnist Joe Schaefer. Good to have you on, Joe.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
Now, Joe, if I were a more suspicious man, I'd say that despite the bitter fallout of the Afghan disaster, Joe Biden has been rather lucky. Prior to this debacle, everyone was talking about the uncontrolled illegal immigration over the southern border, the twisting of economic and job numbers that were destined to hurt, and a whole host of other issues. Now, is handling one big crisis better than 1,000 smaller ones for Joe's political legacy?
I have a bit of a different take on this with Joe Biden's political legacy. We all know he is a figurehead of other figures who are calling the shots behind the curtain. We know this. We've known this all along. And I think you have to look at it from that perspective. You can say that this nexus, this control operation that's been in charge of our political system since George Bush Sr., with the exception, of course, of Donald Trump, you look at these presidents, and I think Biden is similar to George W. Bush, and that being important, being popular, really isn't that important to them. So I don't think he cares about a bad legacy as long as he holds on. I think the interesting thing with Afghanistan is what it's doing to the people in his administration. Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, these people who really thought of themselves as wonderkins, hotshots, their reputation is in tatters. And I don't think that was the plan of this swamp nexus that is really in control of the Biden administration. They didn't count on that.
Yeah, I think you're referring to when Joe Biden is about to deal with questions on the rare occasions that he does, he signifies that, well, I've been told that, or I've been instructed. Now, that's a useful word. I've been instructed that I can call on these particular people. That does not instill confidence, I guess, in the American people. Now, as we know, the approval numbers of Joe Biden have sunk through the floor recently, which, as you point out, many Democrats may well embrace, because after all, they have VP Kamala Harris in the wings. But I think what a lot of folks are missing is that her popularity is even worse than Joe Biden's. I mean, if the latest figures are accurate, she's in Dan Quayle territory. And how does the Democratic Party come back in the 2022 midterms with Joe Biden, who you say is a destructive presence, and Kamala Harris, who's being compared to Dan Quayle? How do they come back for the 2022 midterms?
It's a horrible time to be a Democrat running for re-election. You really want to take a bullet for these people? But this is what you signed on to when you went with the Biden-Harris ticket and said that Trump is an existential disaster and we all have to unite behind this. So you get what you deserve. They are going to have to run a tough campaign against a deeply unpopular president. And again, this administration doesn't care how popular they are. But Kamala Harris being set up as the eventual successor, it was never going to work. She's never been popular. She was a terrible candidate in the Democratic primaries. We saw how they tried to prop her up to top tier status, and she just wilted. She has this habit of wilting every time she gets put in a prominent position. And we saw it again with her border czar role, which was just a complete fiasco. So, they're trying to elevate this person who really doesn't thrive in the spotlight. And if you're a Democrat, you're supposed to be running on this. You're supposed to be aligning yourself with this. I don't see how you can. So for Democrats running for office in 2022, how do you run away from the Biden administration without running away from the Biden administration? It's going to be a real tough call for them.
Now, Joe, will the Afghanistan debacle, the evacuation, will it be an albatross around the party's neck? And if not, why not?
I think it's, again, more of an albatross around these Sharpies in Washington, D.C., who think they know better than all the rest of us. And, it should be very scary for the American people, because what we are realizing is we knew these people are way out of touch with the common people. Elite swamp, party, they're in their own world. What we didn't know is that they're getting to this level of incompetence. They're so cut off from reality in their little world that they can't even perform basic foreign policy functions when they prop themselves up as being foreign policy experts. This bodes very, very dangerous waters for the American people, because these people, whether we like it or not, they are our installed rulers right now. They are in control of the White House. They are in control of Washington, D.C., and they don't seem in touch. They don't seem competent. And, they're not going away. Even if 2022 is a disaster for Democrats, they're still running the White House for another 2 years. It's a very scary thought for the American people. These people don't know what they're doing.
Joe Schaefer, many thanks to you.
Thank you.
Coming up soon on Liberty Nation Radio, we'll be looking at the new laws out of Texas on abortion and constitutional carry. But next up, we have to ask, what fate awaits the Golden State's belabored governor, Gavin Newsom? Is he set to stay in power, or is he just California dreaming? Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the recall election for California Governor Gavin Newsom fast approaching, it's fairly clear that the Golden State DNC are having a crisis of confidence. They're urging Democrat voters not to answer the second question on the ballot. They've released an army of champagne socialists from Tinseltown to drum up support, and even flirted with the idea of having VP Kamala Harris stump for the embattled governor. How desperate must they be? But what does this mean for residents? What does it mean for Golden Staters that have a chance to effect actual change in the West Coast haven of progressive idealism? Perhaps more importantly, so goes California, so goes the nation. Could this be a signifier of America's frustration with the unaccountable elite? Well, no one has followed the story closer than Liberty Nation's national columnist and national treasure, Sarah Cowgill, a biting and brilliant wit with a mind to match. Welcome aboard, Sarah.
Wow, what an introduction. I think I might have to take a moment and compose myself before I come back.
Well, I'll ask the question. You take your moment. So let's cut to the chase.
All right, go ahead. Shoot.
What do the numbers say? Is there a realistic chance that Gavin Newsom could be panhandling in Sonoma and Napa by the end of the month?
Yes, absolutely. The thing is, they haven't done very many polls, and that's Okay, not to sound conspiracy.
That is
oriented
indicative
here.
of itself that they haven't done that many polls. You're absolutely
They
right.
have not done. They've done a handful of polls in this time frame where, in 2003 it was poll after poll after poll after poll. 2018 poll after poll after poll after poll. They haven't done it. There's just a handful, and I think it's because the news is bad. The more they poll, a couple of days ago, another recent survey came out, and it showed that the people pro no on question 1, which is vote no on recall of the governor, that number is shrinking. So it's getting closer to dead even. And basically, statistically, it's dead even. So you've got people that are scrambling to get the vote out, but you've also got people sitting around wanting to figure out what the heck, if they can vote, if they should vote on question number 2, which is the replacement for said recalled governor, and which one. There's a ton of them, and some of them are downright weird, and some of them are pretty capable candidates. So
well, it is California. So are you noticing any difference between polling on likely voters and registered voters? Because between those two, it's always the sin of omission.
Okay, just recently, LA Times came out with, they're keeping track kind of how many people are voting, how many ballots are in. And the ballots in so far are 2-1 Democrat returned ballots. Of course, they can't open them yet and say, oh, they're voting for this or they're voting for that, but they're counting the numbers and they're coming in from Democrats. But on the other hand, what's kind of terrifying to Democrats is that the massive amounts of Republicans who want to vote and are going to vote and have a ballot, they think they're sitting on the ballots because they're trying to figure out how to answer the second question. They are so convinced that, yes, we will recall Gavin Newsom. And this is coming from Republican leaders in California. They are so convinced that the recall will be successful that that second question is dramatically more important to them, obviously, than any Democrat.
Well, let's talk about these California conservatives. Now, that they're a belabored bunch at the best of times. They go into statewide elections with little hope of affecting any change whatsoever. Now, this recall, I think it will come down to one thing, I think. That's turnout. Now, do we expect to see non-Democrat turnout at an almost unheard of level? Because this is what I'm hearing on the ground.
Yes, that you will see a huge amount of people with R on the side of their name coming out. And you're also going to see independents that have kind of had it up to their eyebrows with the antics of this administration. So I think you're going to see a huge number of people just coming out. And I think you're going to find that some normal, maybe centrist type Democrats, they've had enough too. I mean, they're trying to survive in a state that is just blowing out the middle class, and there's craziness going on everywhere. And yet the elite politicians, such as the Speaker of the House and their governor, they're going and getting their hair done and they're shutting down businesses, but yet opening them for their own, personal use. They are telling people they can't go anywhere and you'll get a ticket and you're going to get fined. And yet they show up and go to birthday parties unmasked and having a blast. So there's a lot of people that aren't real happy with what's going on in California. And it's not just Republicans.
Yeah, hypocrisy is the one thing that unites all in opposition. Well, let's talk about those Democrats. Now, I don't mean the dyed-in-the-wool true blue vote for anything that the party puts before them Democrats, but regular voters, which I presume are the majority, the ones who vote for Democratic candidates, but don't tie their actual identity to the party itself. And now, it seems to me that they cannot be happy with Newsom or the California DNC. So all this wealth, all this possibility that California has, and yet the streets are covered in feces and needles. Crime is off the charts. People are literally living in bunk beds and paying thousands of dollars a month for the privilege of it, although it does have a cool name like iBed or something.
Pod living.
Pod living, yeah. And there's the exodus of the middle class that must be reminiscent of a reverse gold rush heading out to, let's call them redder states, Texas, Florida, basically anywhere that's not so punitive with their taxes. What are these folks thinking?
They're thinking, can we save our state? They have to be thinking that. I mean, they've got to be loyal. If you grew up in a state such as California, you remember the glory days. It's a beautiful place. I spent a lot of my summers during college in San Francisco. It was the most beautiful, just amazing city I had ever been in. And so
with
I wanted
flowers
to go.
in your hair, no doubt.
No, I was on the pier eating clam chowder and having sourdough bread. But there's so many beautiful things about that state. The domestic product there is huge. They can't afford for this state to go under, to continue to go under. And so I think they're looking around going, how do we find somebody who, even if it's temporary, even if it's for the next 2 years, maybe the next 6 years, how do we find that person who is going to be a little more hardline socially and a little less punitive on the economic side? And there's a lot of Democratic business owners out there. It's not just Republicans struggling, but like you said, the middle class is bailing out right and left. They're heading to Texas. Some are heading into Arizona. Arizona was getting a little bluer, if you noticed. But I think if you really have some serious, I've lived there forever ties and generations of family, they want that place cleaned up. So that's another a sect of people that are influential and can cross that line.
Sarah Cowgill, thank you ever so much.
Thank you. It was fun.
Stay tuned. Right after this short break, we're talking liberty with Scott D. Cosenza. Texas is now the focal point for the pro-life war, and owning a gun just got a whole lot easier for the constitutionally minded. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. Coming soon. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we are talking liberty with Mr. Scott D. Cosenza to discuss abortion, guns, gun rights, and laws coming onto the books. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
Scott, we've got so much to cover this week. I just want to dive right into it. Abortion. What's happening in Texas?
Yeah, the Lone Star State is making some news this week because the state often applies its new laws to start on September 1st, and that's why these issues are confronting us. And this week, the Texas legislature's law that bans abortion when fetal heartbeat is detected goes into effect. This was a law passed in May. The opponents of it, as you might imagine, have been scrambling to go to court after court to ask them to forbid enforcement of the law. That so far that has been those attempts have been frustrated and unsuccessful. So the Texas abortion ban says that any fetal heartbeat that's detected makes abortion illegal unless there's sort of an emergency exception for the life of the mother. And another component of the law, Mark, which is sort of fascinating, is it gives almost any person the ability for standing to sue to stop that from happening and to sue an abortion provider or other healthcare professional who engages in an abortion when that fetal heartbeat is detected.
A couple of issues on that, Scott. Now, I believe that it's a non-criminal or it wouldn't be punished by jail time, but rather a fine of up to $10,000. Is that correct?
That's right. And that's one of the reasons why that's one of the ways that other people, kind of non-state actors, can sue because of it, because of this civil action or civil enforcement of the law. It is a bit odd.
Now, this new law is based on the identification of a heartbeat, which I believe is around 6 weeks is the number that I'm seeing within the media.
I think cardiac activity is what I've read. So yeah, heartbeat is what's commonly said, and I've seen those reports as well that people say this is about 6 weeks into a pregnancy is when this can typically be detected,
and that's
or
what
as
I want
early
to address.
as 6 weeks in.
That's what I want to address. Now, is the language of the law as stated that it's when there is cardiac activity, or 6 weeks. So, because presumably as technology gets better and better, we might start scientists might start being able to detect cardiac activity prior to the
It's
6
not,
weeks as being so widely
it's not
touted.
time-based. It's based on the actual cardiac activity. And I think you're right. Technology may force that window even further back. I always thought that technology would be the death knell to Roe v. Wade. The more we can see into human development and where it begins, I think the likelihood that, the dialing back the time for when we have, some fertilized cells versus a human being will recede. And that does seem to be what's happening here in Texas.
Okay, let's move on to the other big issue that animates most constitutionally minded Americans, that of gun laws, gun rights, gun restrictions. Now, Texas has recently brought forward a law that allows the carrying of guns without applying for a permit or a license. Tell me a bit more.
Constitutional carry is what we like to call it in the gun rights world, Mark. And Texas did pass a constitutional carry law, which goes into effect the same day as the new abortion law. And basically what it says is that people don't have to apply for any kind of license or permit if they're going to carry a firearm in Texas. If you are legal to carry a firearm in Texas, this doesn't affect anybody who was prohibited from carrying a firearm in Texas. If, for instance, you're a felon or somebody else who is prohibited, you've been adjudicated mentally incompetent, for instance, there's a host of reasons why somebody might not be able to get to legally carry. But if you were legally able to get a permit before the law went into effect, now you're legally able to carry without seeking that permit. It's, I think, a big win for liberty for Texans. The idea that, if carrying a gun is a fundamental right, then the exercise of that right shouldn't carry some kind of permission slip. Those who are forbidden should not do it. And the state has reason to proceed against those folks. But for everybody else, it's a normal activity protecting oneself and should be seen as.
A bit of a question out of left field for you on this, Scott. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of pushback and a lot of negative media stories, specifically aimed at Texas, because Texas is the gun state as far as the rest of the world is concerned. But am I right in thinking that this basically puts it on par with both Vermont and Maine?
Yes, basically. It's funny that you say that about Texas, and I understand that is the Texas reputation, but the law hasn't actually kept up with that or met that reputation. When the revolution of shall issue concealed carry laws swept across the country, Texas was late to the game, believe it or not. Florida really was the first to step up in that place. And Vermont has always had amazing gun laws in terms of, for those of us who appreciate the right to keep and bear arms and celebrate it, but there's just not enough people for it to really matter statistically. So nobody really knew about the Vermont gun laws, but they have always been very good there. And there are a number of other states that have constitutional carry, but they're generally rural states that don't have the population mass that Texas does. That's the first big constitutional carry state, Mark. And I think it's going to make a huge difference for Texans, who don't have to ask for permission to exercise their rights. But you're right about that. Those scare stories, I'm sure they're already being written. Just the details haven't been filled in yet about who's killed whom. It's just one less charge that they can add on to somebody. If somebody does break a law and assault somebody or kill somebody with a firearm, that of course is already illegal in Texas, and those laws.
So I hear,
changed.
although based on the media,
Yes.
it'd be difficult to believe.
Right.
Well, I expect we shan't be hearing from Angus King or Bernie Sanders on opposing this in their precarious positions. Now, there is one more gun case I want to discuss, Scott, and this is, well, it's not a case as such, but the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, after a long hiatus on having an official opinion on gun rights and gun violence, in fact, it seems that Director Rachel Walensky is ready to wade back in. What's happening?
Well, that's right, Mark. It seems like this is sort of like the full court press we saw last, I think, under the Clinton administration. And what Clinton did was every agency was responsible for moving the ball on the anti-gun policy issue. So you'd see these anti-gun pronouncements from housing and urban development, or the Department of Education. You think that seems like an odd place. Well, that was because it was an across-the-board crush against gun rights, and I think this is what we're seeing here by the CDC. You know, they're having a tough enough time dealing with this global pandemic, and their own advice and guidance for Americans, often contradictory on how to proceed against it. But somehow there's time in the day to proceed against guns as well. And I think that we should expect more efforts from the administration to come at our fundamental right to keep and bear arms from sort of oblique angles. And that's what I see from the CDC. So I expect to see studies, talking about how guns are dangerous for peaceable people.
Here's the thing, Scott. Many people who are in favor of gun rights and the freedom to express those gun rights are rightly worried that the CDC will be coming at it from an angle of the answer. We know the answer will be, well, you need restrictions. That's the answer. Yeah, we know it is.
Mark,
there's no surprise here.
None of the studies are going to show. You know what? CDC under Joe Biden says all Americans should have a gun with them within reach at all times, right?
But Scott, wasn't there actually, isn't it the CDC that first brought to attention that the number of defensive uses of guns, which to my mind, as a non-American, this seems to be the best argument for having a firearm. I believe it was, they registered 2.5 million defensive uses, which far outweigh offensive uses, meaning that although people discuss the crime rate, the assault rate, the murder rate through the use of firearms, it would be far higher if it weren't for the defensive uses. And in fact...
Well, that's true. And also the defensive use statistics are notoriously hard to figure. And the reason why is because if a shot wasn't fired, oftentimes there's no record of a defensive use. So they're resulting to polling rather than actual police report data. And when somebody's shot and killed by a firearm in the United States, there's all kinds of record keeping about that. But if somebody just has a firearm on them and that prevents the furtherance of violence, oftentimes there is no data to support it. And so the gun rights folks have for really decades and decades, Mark, put forth the notion that the defensive use of firearms is actually massively undercounted.
Yeah, I think the CDC will not be focusing on that particular aspect under the Biden administration. Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much for being here.
Thanks, Mark.
And that about wraps it up for Liberty Nation Radio this week. I want to thank our amazing guests, Dave Patterson, Joe Schaefer, Sarah Cowgill, and the always inspiring Mr. Scott DeCosenza Esquire. But most of all, I want to again thank you, the listeners, for being here. The road to freedom, it's never an easy one to tread, and for many of us, it can be a lonely one. To know that you folks are out there walking the same path, facing the same foes, and defending the same liberties that seem so often under attack means that we're not alone. It reminds me of the words of Benjamin Franklin, who said, quote, "Our cause is the cause of all mankind. We are fighting for their liberty in defending our own." Until next time, let's take courage in the fact that our cause is the cause of all, whether they know it or not. I'm Mark Angelides on Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. Thank you for being here and thank you for listening. Until next time. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.